Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a pretty profound paradigm shift regarding biblical prophecy. We're tackling a question that has honestly puzzled scholars and believers for centuries. Who or what is the real Gog? We're going to examine a fascinating source document that challenges the popular modern narratives and takes us deep into the historical, geographical, and linguistic context to uncover the truth. So let's just jump right in. We're looking at a framework called the Matrix of Gog and the Two Temples. This source text completely reframes our understanding of the prophet Ezekiel and the famous words of YaHUsha in Matthew 24. To unpack all this logically, we'll hit 5 key areas: the Matrix of Gog, the latter days identified, explaining Matthew 24 clearly, Rome as the physical Gog, and finally, the final spiritual onslaught.
All right, Section 1, the Matrix of Gog.
The source text makes a really compelling argument right off the bat. Gog isn't just a single person or a modern political nation. Rather, it acts as a recurring matrix. Now, the dictionary defines a matrix as something within or from which something else originates, develops, or takes form. The text uses a brilliant analogy here. Think of it like a cake pan shaped to a very specific character. You can use that exact same pan repeatedly to bake different cakes over time. In this framework, the ultimate matrix of Gog is the adversary, Satan, who essentially uses different earthly leaders that perfectly fit into this pan during specific eras to launch attacks against Elohim's people.
Now, what's wild is how translating just a single word can change absolutely everything. A super popular modern view claims that the Hebrew word rush in Ezekiel refers to modern-day Russia. But the source text points out a pretty massive problem with that. Russia didn't even exist in Ezekiel's time. In Hebrew, rush is actually just a translatable noun meaning head, chief, or leader. Exactly like how Rosh Hashanah means the head of the year. So translating it simply as chief completely removes Russia from Ezekiel's ancient prophecy. Instead, the source urges us to look at the actual geographical reality of Ezekiel's day. The regions Ezekiel mentioned, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah, were primarily settled by the descendants of Japheth. Geographically, they were located south and east of the Black Sea. That corresponds mostly to modern-day Turkey. So as you can see, these ancient regions were nowhere near Moscow.
Moving right along, Section 2, the latter days identified. Ezekiel prophesied that Gog would come in the latter days. Now, we usually hear that phrase and think, the end of the world. But according to the source, it didn't mean the end of the entire world at all. It meant the end of the Old Testament era and the end of Judah's earthly rule. If we look at the historical timeline, Jacob prophesied way back in Genesis that the scepter would not depart from Judah until Shiloh, meaning the Messiah came. YaHUsha took over that rulership around 31 AD. Therefore, the latter days culminated in the 1st century, officially ending the Old Testament era with the destruction of the Herodian temple in 70 AD. The source highlights this profound 40-year transition period. It's a literal generation overlapping between the Old Covenant age ending and the New Covenant age emerging. It kicks off at the cross around 30 AD and ends exactly when that physical temple fell in 70 AD. Which brings us to the core of this whole thing. Section 3, explaining Matthew 24 clearly. After telling his disciples that not one stone of the temple would be left upon another, YaHUsha gave them this massive, ominous warning. He said, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, let them which be in Judea flee." By saying this, he was directly connecting their immediate impending future right back to the terrifying prophecies of both Ezekiel and Daniel. So, to explain Matthew 24 clearly, the source makes a crucial point. We have to recognize that the disciples were actually asking 2 entirely distinct questions. Question 1 was, when shall these things be? Meaning, when exactly is this physical temple going to be destroyed? And question 2 was, what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? YaHUsha answers both, for sure, but we absolutely must distinguish between the era that had to end first and the ultimate end of the world. The text explains that YaHUsha was answering the first question by warning them about an impending abomination of desolation. An abomination is defined as something done to affect or completely ruin the worship of YaHUaH. Historically, Antiochus Epiphanes had defiled the temple between the testaments, right? Well, YaHUsha was warning that a similar but far worse abomination was coming in their very generation. Pagan Romans would soon storm the physical temple in 70 AD, utterly ruining the place of worship.
Okay, Section 4, Rome as the physical Gog. Let's connect these historical dots.
When the source overlaps the historical geography, something incredible is revealed. Those specific ancient regions Ezekiel prophesied about, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Cush, Put, they didn't just vanish. By the 1st century, they were entirely swallowed up and incorporated into the massive Roman Empire. And the historical records actually prove this astonishing connection. When the Roman emperors Vespasian and Titus attacked Jerusalem, their army wasn't just made up of soldiers marching straight from Italy. No, they used specific, localized legions stationed out in the provinces. The legions they marched into Judea were sourced directly from the Euphrates, Cappadocia, Syria, and Africa. Put simply, Rome built its invading army from the exact geographical areas Ezekiel explicitly named centuries earlier. It's really mind-blowing when you think about it. So, the physical manifestation of the Gog matrix in the 1st century was the Roman military machine. They literally acted as the abomination of desolation, destroying the physical Herodian temple, ending the Old Testament era, and perfectly fulfilling that first part of YaHUsha's prophecy in Matthew 24. Finally, Section 5, the final spiritual onslaught. To understand the future, the source traces a fascinating lineage. In the Septuagint translation, the title Agag, which refers to the kings of Amalek and Edom, is completely synonymous with Gog. What's crazy is that Rome, operating as Gog, actually transferred local power in Judea to King Herod, who was an Edomite. Historical records from Josephus note that the Edomites eventually assimilated entirely into the Jewish population, effectively disappearing into 1st century Judaism. They brought that ancient spiritual enmity right into the religious system itself. And this brings us to the ultimate takeaway from this entire framework. Gog launched an attack on the physical Jerusalem and the physical temple in 70 AD, and will do the exact same to the spiritual Jerusalem and temple at the end of time. Because we are now in the New Testament era, the source concludes that the final future attack by Gog isn't going to be on a physical building made of stone in the Middle East. Instead, it will be a spiritual onslaught against the spiritual temple, meaning the Heavenly Tabernacle and the believers themselves, the New Jerusalem. So as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves a profound question based on this text. By focusing all our attention on modern political nations and physical geography, are we completely missing the spiritual matrix of Gog operating all around us today? Are we mistakenly looking for a physical enemy in what has become an ultimate spiritual battle? It's a perspective that definitely challenges us to reread these ancient prophecies with fresh, spiritually discerning eyes. Thanks so much for joining me as we walked through this compelling source material.